The next thing I wanted to talk about are the types of testing available. Types of testing, a lot of this is very similar to traditional software testing. So if you have a traditional background in software testing or the software development lifecycle, these might seem very familiar, but they're good to reiterate and talk about them in a mobile world because sometimes they're a little different. So there's functional testing. I think most people should know what functional testing does. Does the application do what it's supposed to do? When I click this button, does this happen? When I click this icon, does this happen? When I put my name here, does it register to the server, right? Functional testing, obviously, one of the most important things you can do on any application, right? The application doesn't work, it's useless. Usability and user experience are mobile. These are important on desktop apps. They're even more important on mobile application, right? You got to do some additional checks over standard application testing. Is it intuitive? Keep in mind that a lot of the people who are using mobile applications may not be as savvy as people who are using, traditional desktop applications, right? Mobile devices are designed in most cases for people to be able to easily go through and use them, and access features and open apps and all. One of the reasons that a lot of people like iOS and Apple is because they think the user interface is very simple as compared to Android, which is generally associated with people who want to, kind of have more control and do a little more. But still, don't assume that the person using the phone is an expert by any means, right? Within your application, how do you make it simple, flow well? Is it designed for a mobile experience? Okay, don't take a desktop version of the application and have it shrunk to the mobile, right? Again, we're talking things that developers and all should do, but as you're testing, you have to think of these things, right? And is a user going to be able to simply understand this, see it, use it, get around, work through the app? Does it fit the familiar look of other mobile applications? Right? Apple's very strict on this, making a cohesive user experience. Google, Android, less so, but still, from a development perspective, give people what they're familiar with, right? Don't try and reinvent a control. I can give you an example that we were having a talk about a feature in our Android app, and one of the product engineers were in there were saying, can we make this option box that you click on, can we make it like a drop-down list of items to choose, like it is on the iOS version of the app, right? And there isn't a control on Android that actually simulates a drop-down. What Android does is when you click the options list, it puts like a pop-up window and lists the options, right? That's the traditional Android experience. To go back and try and replicate what the iOS does by having an actual drop-down list, sure, we could write a control and try and code that or whatever, but we're deviating from the traditional Android experience that the user should be used to seeing in other apps. Okay, so be aware of those types of things, right? Did we over-engineer it to make it and not just take advantage of what's available on the mobile platform? Okay. Does it meet vendor requirements? I touched on this a second ago. Not so important for Google yet and Android yet. In the iOS world, we know that Apple reviews all the applications that get posted in their marketplace. Apple has their suggested guidelines for applications. If your application doesn't meet those guidelines, they will reject it from the marketplace. Microsoft's kind of in between Apple and iOS right now. They also review their apps, and I've seen apps rejected for not meeting some requirements they have. Google doesn't really have any requirements at this point. A lot of their review process is done post-elevation. It gets to the marketplace, they hear reports, and then they look into it. But they have released, at least with Ice Cream Sandwich, device guidelines, design guidelines for mobile applications on their platform. So they're not enforcing them, but with the pressure that goes on, I wouldn't doubt if we see Google eventually implement some sort of review process. Whether they'll go to the point of Apple to actually review the design and layout, I'm not sure, but we'll see.
Okay. This guideline has human interface guideline as well?
Yes, the Google ones, yes. They're basic interface, human interface guidelines for Ice Cream Sandwich. Again, there's not being enforced when you upload the market, right, but it's the recommended human interface guidelines and application design guidelines, yes. Okay. We talked about that. Let's talk about performance. Extremely important for mobile devices. We'll touch on this a little more later on. Memory, CPU, and battery I mentioned earlier. Network utilization is another one. This may not be as common over here in India, or maybe to some degree, but in the US especially, we have the concept of tiered plans, where you buy how much usage you want a month off your plan, and when you go over, they start charging you overage fees, kind of like the old days of, or even the current days of some cell phone companies and all, if you don't have unlimited plans for data minutes. So be aware that how much network utilization is your app using, right? That's something, as working for a company who develops apps, we've had customers ask that. How much data a month does your application transmit on average? right? In the US, we have cell phone plans as little as 256 megabytes a month. It's not a lot. That can be used up quickly, right? You can watch 2 YouTube videos and that'll be gone. So it's very important that you keep your application's network utilization to a minimum. So that's important for performance testing. And then finally, upgrade testing. There are 2 types of upgrade testing you want to be aware of. Not just your application, but OS updates. Okay, I'll share a little story there where I worked on an application that was written for Android, originally for Android 2.2. We had it deployed on some customers, and then 2.3 upgrades started getting pushed out. When the 2.3 upgrades got pushed out, the customer's applications stopped working. The application just froze, didn't work anymore. And what we found is Google had fixed a bug in an encryption algorithm that was used on the 2.2 operating system, and that encrypts up and down, but whenever possible you should. So there are methods out there for rolling back devices to earlier versions and then being able to upgrade them. Okay, so you want to be aware of that upgrades to the OS can be just as important as upgrades to your application. Okay.
So on the iOS side,
Mhm.
can you as a developer do the upgrades on your phone before customer sees it?
So I know it's much more challenging on iOS. You may be able to talk a little bit better
Yeah,
than me.
you can do that. If it is Apple will release beta versions before.
Okay, but the final, before it goes to the final build?
Yeah, yeah. So
Around seconds.
you can try the upgrades. You have to be part of the
Developer
developer program,
Okay.
and then you have access to the beta drop of seeds. Is what you call it.
Generally, once they go GA and you upgrade a device, it's extremely hard to roll back an Apple device. I actually saw someone sent me a link just like yesterday that there's a company out there who claims to have a tool that they can roll back iOS devices to earlier versions. The problem is Apple, when they go to a new major OS update, they actually change something in the boot code or whatever, the boot ROM, that is not undoable and that is incompatible with the old version. So I'm curious to look at this company and see what they've done. With Android, with certain devices, because of the open source and the development community and custom ROMs and all, you know, custom ROMs get a bad name, but these guys also release ways to restore the factory ROM, which is really good. So hey, you know, let's unlock the device, let's roll it back to the factory ROM and then relock it. You know, you can do those types of things. So is it easy? Is it like a 1, 2, 3 process? No. But if you pick certain devices that you can do it on, you know, that you know have good ROMs available and flexibility to roll back and forward, you can test most of these things. Okay.
I have a question on network utilization.
Yes.
How is it, what are the parameters, how do you measure that? Because a phone could be connected to Wi-Fi, different sites.
Mm-hmm.
So normally when you say network utilization, the measurement is done on the data network.
Sure. Yes. So how I tackled it with our developers is in the logs. Every time they do a data transmission or receive data, they log for me how much. They log for me the size of the transfer. So then all I got to do is run all my tests, pull the logs off the device, and go in and look for a specific thing. That's an easy way that I recommend doing it. You are correct. You could put other applications on the PC to like measure utilization of a network, but the problem is that rarely do they do it at the app level. There are some that try. I don't know how accurate they are, but you're correct. There's other applications going on. Generally, an application should use the same amount of data regardless of transport it's on. Some applications will restrict certain activities when they're on roaming. Generally, what you do is you do things less often, right? So if your application needs to talk to a server once an hour, which that can be too often, when you're roaming, make it once a day, right? So that it's not using as much of the bandwidth on roaming because it's more, precious, expensive, however you want to put it. But again, for measuring your application specifically, important to get in this with the developers early, be like, hey, I need to test how much network this feature is going to use. Can you just drop in a log file every time you send a packet the size of it? And from working with my developers, that was a very easy change for them to do. So that would be my suggestion for it. There are tools and all you can use to try and measure that as well. Just make sure you get one that actually shows your application versus other applications. Okay.
So but are there apps that only, for example, we have so many commercial apps,
Mhm.
download apps.
Mhm.
So they can be restricted to download apps only if there's a Wi-Fi access, if there is not.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
we can have that kind of, do we
Absolutely.
have choices that we
Yes, absolutely. A well-designed app a good designed app that needs network utilization will take advantage to some degree of knowing what transport the user is available on. One of the options I mentioned were the timers, right? If you're writing some sort of security application that needs to talk to the server, you should have some sort of control on how often it talks or transmits data, right? The other option is to give the user the ability to do it. For example, if you're going to download a large amount of extra software for your application, that's a common thing now, where you put a small size app in a marketplace to get downloaded quick, and then when they run it the first time, it says, I need to download resource files, right? To give the user, either tell the user, hey, I noticed you're not over Wi-Fi. Sometimes you could force them to be on Wi-Fi to download it, right? Sometimes you may give them the option. It really depends on the development, what you choose in your application and how important that data is to be transmitted. So the answer to your question is yes, there's multiple ways to do it. You can check based on transport, you can give the user the option. It's really the designers, developers of the application's choice in how they want to implement that to do it. In our applications, since we are security app based, we tend to reduce the frequency of what we do when you're on a roaming network, as to not, cause additional data usage for the user. So instead of once every 4 hours, we might go once every 8 hours or once a day.
Is there a considerable business impact in making this choice? Because normally, from a developer's point of view, we really don't bother much about it. The user is going to pay for it. It's going to please the user.
Mhm.
But there is a kind of a balance, In the long term, you don't want to have a bad reputation.
I agree.
But it's not really easy to track this. Because
Sure. It depends on what your application is designed for. If your application is something that an end user is paying for and upfront knows what they're getting, I would agree with you. It's probably not as much a concern. If you are developing an application that's going to be used for business purposes, it's much more important, right? In today's world of what we call BYOD, bring your own device, right? Companies want users or allowing users to bring their own devices into the workplace, but then they're setting some requirements around it. Okay, I'm going to control your email policies. I need you to have the following security applications installed, right? In that case, any end user would love to be able to go to the company and say, I pay for my own data plan, and this application you made me install used half my data usage in 2 days, right? So in those cases, you do need to be more aware and more conscious of what your application does. If you're developing a game or you're developing a utility, a newsreader or something for someone that they're going to open and use when they want, then you probably don't have to be as much concerned. It would be good to know, because you never know, some users may complain or ask, right? This is more important for applications that run in the background. If your application runs in the background and regularly pulls in for new news feeds or new data and downloads it, you should be aware of how often it's doing it, right? If it's re-downloading the same news headers, every 10 minutes, that adds up over time, right? So understanding that, there's value in understanding it, but you have to know the line of where it's good to actually, where it's most important, where it's not. And it really does depend on the type of application you're developing. If it's an application the user has to open whenever they want to use, well then, yeah, they're assuming that whatever data usage it does, it does. But if it's a business app, something that runs in the background, something that downloads regular updates, be aware of what it's using, because then you're more likely to get feedback on that. Okay.
The profiling tool on ICS, doesn't it cover only mobile data, or it has categories of both? How much of Wi-Fi bandwidth was used and how much mobile data?
I'm actually not sure.
It is only mobile data.
Only mobile data?
Over there.
Which is what you're primarily concerned with?
Yes, we're generally concerned over, of mobile data. Yeah, Wi-Fi you generally don't concern yourself with, right? There may be some companies that are, because they don't want 50 user cell phones sucking up bandwidth, but the concern mostly is mobile data.
But it's largely dependent on the user experience, right? If the user is largely connected to Wi-Fi, they will not see any.
Correct. They won't see as much performance impact or whatever Wi-Fi. Absolutely. Yeah, and like I said, in the mobile data world, it really comes down to cost. The days of unlimited plans are going away. Right? I would think within the next year, you're going to see very few, if any, unlimited data plans out there. Everyone's going to be tiered, right? Once you reach a certain tier, you're either going to get cut off and charged extra, or you're going to be severely throttled down to very low speeds. Okay.
If there are issues with OS updates, can we give different builds for different OS versions?
You can, if there is specifically things you want to take advantage of. I wouldn't recommend it because it's more cohesive if your users have one place to go. Now, if you can design it so that when they search in the marketplace, they'll see the one that's specific for their version, sure. From a support perspective, though, and a quality assurance perspective, there's nothing I dislike more than having to test the same feature in multiple versions of an application, right? We've had that talk many times. Developers have said, hey, we want to build one version of the agent that works on Samsung devices and one version of the agent that works on these devices, or on HTC devices, to take advantage of some of the inherent features. Yeah, but 70% of the functionality is the same on both, and I'm going to have to test it both times, right? You know, you can never assume. In my opinion, it's better to develop one app that does both, right? Yes, it's a bigger app. There's a point where you'd have to make a decision, right? If it would make them significantly smaller. But when possible, I would recommend trying to do one application. When you design Android applications, there's a minimum SDK version you set. That doesn't prevent you from taking advantage of features in higher SDK versions, right? And the other thing is, if you design a 2.2 version, a 2.3 version of the app, what happens when the user downloads that new 2.3 update that just came out to his phone and the application is suddenly broken, right? He's going to lose all his data because he has to downstall the 2.3 version. So I would recommend trying to avoid that or going against that. I'm a fan of single application whenever possible. Just like I see a lot of vendors who do HD versions of apps versus non-HD versions. If you have a lot of heavy graphics and stuff that makes the package size very big, I can see the need for that. But if your application is not very graphics intensive, doesn't have a lot of large resource files to take advantage of the tablet, just has different interface layouts and maybe some buttons that are different qualities, go with the single app. I think it's a more cleaner experience for the end user, especially if it's a paid app. You have to pay for both the, tablet version and the smartphone version.
So practically you will face an issue, right? When user would prefer a latest version, he wants to upgrade the OS,
Yes.
and then the apps would not, most of the apps would not be supporting. So in fact, the apps should check for the version and say, either download the latest one or you cannot download this.
You could, as long as the application will still open and do that functionality, absolutely, yes. One of the things we'll talk about is that you can use the marketplace notification for upgrades. Only happens generally once a day. Once a day, Google will refresh the upgrade notification for your device. If you have a smart application, you can build a secondary one into yours where you'll actually notify through your application, hey, there's an upgrade available, right? Now again, that's another use of the network. So how often do you check that it's there, right? Now if you have a server-side application, you can do more of a push notification to, let the application know there's an update rather than have the application polling in.